So go ahead, Gavin.
All right. Hello, everybody. My name is Gavin Van Horn. I work for the Center for Humans and Nature, and I am a symbiont. All right. So this is from the introduction, as John said. The essays and poems you hold in your hands comprise lines, strands of ink, patterns on paper. In your imagination, these words may come to life, recalling and revealing shared relations with our fellow earthlings, our kinfolk, who come in all shapes and sizes, from the bacterium swimming in your belly or lying on the tip of your tongue, to the vibrant collective breath that sweeps across your face and into your lungs. Worth thinking about, and perhaps thinking about, are the shared threads between kinfolk, especially plant folk, that make this breath exchange possible. Your life, my life, all our lives depend on the quality of relations between us. The air we breathe, the water we drink, the food we eat, and the food we become, within an exuberant, life-generating planetary tangle capable of nurturing intelligences that can spin webs and words.
Thank you, Gavin.
Sure. John, did you want me to say anything about the framing of the volumes?
Yeah, if there's anything you wanted to add to that, I mean, the paragraph really speaks for itself, but you wrote it a while ago. So is there anything that you would want to add to it to just frame the 5 volumes?
Well, I think that if you've already read the books or part of the books and introduction, then I kind of hit on 3 key points that really fed into the creation of this series. One of those things was that we live in a world of non-human persons, and the recent and increasing legal designations of living entities as persons was some of the inspiration for this book. And the second point was that we live in communities that can be considered kincentric ecologies. That's a word that Enrique Salmon uses to describe the ways that humans can participate and collaborate in the mutual flourishing of their communities and their ecosystems. And then the third sort of thread, if you will, if we're calling what we're doing here, and the metaphor I used was a spider's web, the third thread in this supporting this web of words was the idea of language, the address that we use toward other beings. And that comes from Robin's work, which I'm sure she'll speak to, what she calls the grammar of animacy. And another way of thinking about it, maybe a simple way of thinking about it, is watch your pronouns. The world we live in is not comprised of it's comprised of he, she's, theys, and possibly he. And so this is a world, kinship is not just defined by our biological or genetic composition. It's defined by our relations and our relationships. So I'm grateful to be part of this group tonight in this first volume, which is about planet. We went from macro to micro, and we started in volume 1 with planet. And I think you're going to hear a lot tonight about the ways that we can be good earthlings and the joy of being earthlings with other earthlings.
Thank you, Gavin. Yeah, and so, the 5 volumes, like Gavin just said, we wanted to look at kinship on multiple scales. And we went from broadest to most narrow. So we went from planet to place to, let's see here, partners to persons, and then practice. How do we live out this? How do we act as kin, as kind of a verb? How do we do kinning? Like tonight we are kinning. A lot of these authors haven't met each other. We haven't met folks who are among our readers, and we are kinning. We are creating a relationship here, creating an intellectual family through the act of kinning, as we figure out how across cultures and across species we can kin as well. Planet, the planetary scale, I think in some ways has gotten a little roughed up lately. I think we're in a place-based, in my view, place-based revolution in which a lot of folks are thinking of us as placelings rather than earthlings. There's a critique that we did not evolve a consciousness to have ethical concern on a planetary scale. We evolved the consciousness to have ethical concern of maybe on the scale of the watershed, right? And so there's some concern about scaling up to planet. There's a critique in a book called Climate Change from the Streets that looks at climate action plans, and too many of them are at a planetary scale that causes actors to focus just on CO2. But if you focus down to the local scale, suddenly you start to look at how communities of color are being polluted for things way beyond CO2 on the global scale. And you start to look at the democratization of the solution in a way that cap and trade and offsets on the global scale, the planetary scale, don't always get at. And so planet's been under a bit of a critique more recently. And so tonight will be fun to make a case for planet, to make a case of seeing the planetary scale, the planet as our kin. And I'm really excited for that as somebody who focuses on the place thing side of my own work. My chapter's in place. So what we're going to do here tonight is you're going to meet some authors that many of you have been reading. It's fun to see their face, hear their voice. And so what we're going to do is have it just flow, where each author will say their name, however they want to say where they are located, and then whatever title they want to give for themselves. And so I'm John Hausdoerffer. I'm at Mount Crested Butte, 9,000 feet above sea level, Ute homeland. The Ute called this edge between subalpine forest and above tree line, the line between center earth and upper earth. And my section honors the fact that we're having this conversation right on the eve of the solstice, of the winter solstice. And this is a story about me on solstice night, figuring out where to spread my brother-in-law's ashes while skiing. We pulled my daughter Adelia, a toddler, my baby nephew Tyus, in sleds behind us as we skied to the shack. It was on this solstice trip that I first learned that kinship with land requires kinship with people on the land. On our second night, the solstice itself, Abe and I ventured out on skis for a quick sunset view, thinking it would take half an hour. The ski lasted 3 hours because the sky refused to darken. The sun sank slowly into Fossil Ridge to the west, transforming the white-peaked Continental Divide to the east into a canvas of orange and rose alpenglow. As the alpenglow receded into twilight, the sky shifted to 1,000 shades of purple, coloring snowy ground and white aspen in violet hues. For a brief moment, Abe and I lived in a world of purple, underfoot, overhead, and from all directions, as if cosmos and land and us were merged as one. Heather?
You're on mute, Heather.
Thank you so much. I'm so honored to be with all of you. I feel like this is such an important project that we're all a part of. I'm reading from the Yahara watershed, which was originally the land of the Ho-Chunk, and I am the poet of the bumblebee, the sandhill cranes, and the barred owls. I'll be reading my poem Directive, which I have to say is written in response to Robert Frost's poem Directive. Here it is. In this world of waters, the unleashed waters, we wend our way, not heeding the beacons, while the snow geese wait for ice that never arrives, and the swans move southward but tarry. Who designed our faulty compass? We must stop now and scrape the soil clear of plastic shards and dead grass, and with our fingernails etch a new map, born of bone, aware of our kinship with ash, with crickets, with wrens.
Thank you for that, Heather. It's so good to be with all of you. Bonjour, Shabadaske Gish Kokwe. I'm Robin Kimmerer. I am speaking to you from Maple Nation, where the trees are getting the beginning of their good rest right now, and in the homelands of my neighbors, the Onondaga Nation. And gosh, I loved it when John said we could adopt a title for ourselves. I decided that I would like to be the Senior Vice President for Plant Listening and Berry Eating. I'm going to read a bit from my essay about the plant family reunion. Have you ever been at a reunion or a big party when the plates are empty and conversations wind down and you think about leaving? Then you hear peals of laughter and the clatter of dishes and contagious giggles from behind the kitchen door. That's where the real party is, as the aunties portion out leftovers to be taken home, scrape the dishes, and laugh with their hands in hot soapy water, snapping damp towels as they dry pots and pans. It's one thing to be invited to the party. Then you have a choice: to remain a polite guest in a distant armchair, or to walk through that kitchen door and roll up your sleeves, to be washed in love and laughter. Kinfolk are made by reciprocity. No one needs to be lonely. They're doing dishes in Mother Earth's kitchen. Nokmas holds open the door and waves you in. This is how remembering begins.
It's a delight to be with you. It's an honor to follow you, my friend Robin, and to see some many friends here in front of me. My name is Bren Taylor, and I have something of multiple identity disorder. But for tonight, I'll just say that I'm a part-time marine mammal currently living near the Atlantic Ocean off the coast of a state that today is most commonly called Florida. On the due date of our first child, my very pregnant wife and I were swimming outside the surf line off the Southern California coast. Suddenly, we were surrounded by a pod of dolphins. They swam with us for quite a while, whistling and chirping, and it seemed to us singing as though they recognized that another swimming mammal would soon give birth. Were they, in their own way, excited for us, welcoming a new one to their watery world? Decades later, I learned that female dolphins sing to their babies while in the womb, which renewed my wonderings. Experiences such as the one I had with the dolphin pod have informed my scholarly pursuits. Indeed, for decades, I have wandered through the environmental milieu, the diverse venues where environmentally engaged individuals and groups encounter and influence one another. I've interviewed hundreds of Greens, tracked the writers and scientists, activists and artists, and a host of others whom these ardent environmentalists say have inspired them. I've read scores of historical and social scientific studies that address the research question that has long preoccupied my attention. What might mobilize our species to respond effectively to slow and eventually halt the accelerating anthropogenic reduction of Earth's biological and cultural diversity? Among the things I have learned is that feelings of kinship with species other than our own often animate behaviors that promote environmental health and the conservation of biodiversity. These feelings are integrated into an overall worldview, a cosmovision that includes a cosmogony, an understanding of how the world came to be, perceptions of belonging to nature, humility about the human place in the world, convictions that all living things have intrinsic value, and love and loyalty to Earth and its living systems. There are many specific experiences and insights that lead to such dark green worldviews, as I've come to call them. Those who find their way to such understandings do so via three main paths, I think: through direct, visceral sensory experiences in nature, through the arts, and through the sciences. These paths are not separate, however. They weave back and forth in reciprocally influential ways through the lives of diverse individuals and groups, much as they are tonight.
Thanks, Bron. I'm Marcia Bjornerud. I'm speaking to you from the edge of the ancient Superior Craton on the homelands of the Menominee people. In my day job, I study how mountains grow. And I'm also, I guess, a rock translator for people who don't speak rock. I try to act as an intermediary. And my little morsel tonight is an appeal that rocks too should be invited to Robin's family reunion. Because contrary to the reputation, rocks are alert, responsive, and communicative. They're the force field in which we live, the infrastructure of our existence. If we sit down quietly and listen to them, we will also find that rocks are raconteurs, companions, mentors, oracles, kin. Defining ourselves as earthlings, creatures made from the rocks and waters of this endlessly inventive planet, can provide a feeling of embeddedness in the cosmos, a sense of continuity with past and future, and a reassuring vision of durability at a time when so many human systems seem fragile.
Gorgeous. Thank you all. I'm Dave Abram, speaking here from Pueblo country in the upper Rio Grande Valley in northern New Mexico. And I'm just a nature bumpkin. Here are 9 sentences about creaturely migrations on a breathing planet. Perhaps it'd be useful now and then to consider the large collective migrations of various creatures as active expressions of the earth itself, to consider them as slow gestures of a living geology, improvisational experiments that gradually stabilized into habits now necessary to the ongoing metabolism of the sphere. Think of the salmon, this gift born of the rocky gravels and melting glaciers, nurtured by colossal cedars and by tumbled trunks decked with moss, fungi, and ferns, an aquatic muscled energy strengthening itself in the forested mountains until it's ready to be released into the broad ocean. Pouring seaward, it adds itself to that voluminous cauldron of currents spiraling in huge gyres, shaded by algal blooms and charged by faint glissandos of whale song, until, grown large with the sea's abundance, this ocean-infused life flows back up the rivers and tributaries and spreads out into the wooded valleys, gifting the hollows and the needled highlands with new minerals and nutrients, feeding bears and osprey and eagles, ensuring that the glinting gift will be reborn afresh from a lump of luminous eggs stashed beneath the layer of pebbles. This circulation, this systole and diastole, is one of the surest signs that this earth is alive. A rhythmic pulse of silvery glacier-fed brilliance pouring through various arteries into the wide body of the ocean, circulating and growing there, only to return by various veins to the beating heart of the forest, gravid with new life. Or perhaps it's better to think of this seasonal reciprocity as a kind of breathing, an exhalation of millions of young salmon smolts down from the tree-thick mountains and meadows, and then out into that roiling cosmos of currents and tidal flows to mingle with zooplankton and seals and squids. And then the great in-breath, the drawing in of living nourishment from the sea into river mouths and estuaries, inhaling the salmon up the rivers into streams, and from there into the branching becks, rills, and runnels that filter into the green forests, the living lungs of this biosphere. Or is it the broad-bellied ocean that's breathing, sucking these finned nutrients down from the shaded slopes, luring them over rocks and through rapids and hydroelectric dam spillways, drawing them past bustling cities and factories, through intersecting gradients of toxic effluents that sting their mouths and strafe their exposed membranes, and on out into the heaving whirl of the sea's innards, circulating this glimmering nourishment within itself before exhaling it back, a long sighing breath up into the wooded valleys. However else we might view them, these large migrations of various species are a primary way that the biosphere cleanses and flexes its various organs, replenishing itself each region drawing insight from the others, concentrating and transforming such qualities before releasing them abroad. Divergent places trading perspectives along with nutrients and nucleotides, the whole half-shadowed sphere steadily experimenting, improvising, slowly altering its display to the blazing fire watching from afar as the reflective moon rolls on round.
Wow. Thank you, David. Can you see my gill plates?
Yeah.
My name is Drew Lanham, and I am in Seneca, South Carolina, in the shadow of the Southern Appalachian escarpment that the Cherokee once called the Blue Wall. I am the Wizard of Odds, that's ornithologically distracted disorder, an official bird brain, and a logger-headed man. I'll share with you tonight a few lines from an incantation. Now, in this Anthropocene, in this present age of an angst-ridden us, the questions we face as conservationists is as caretakers of something larger than our human animal being, and beyond the span of our conceited sapiens thinking. As lovers of wildness and wild things, and hopefully of one another, there is now more than ever in our warmed earth life extincting predicament a necessary convergence. These convergences coalesce around the most basic of questions. One might even call these requisites standards. Although the issues we face are daunting in their potential to disrupt life as we know it, and complex and caused and difficult in solving, I believe there are times when even the simplest of assumptions need restating. Think of the reassessment as an old path, one established first by the woods-going habits of deer and foxes, of bears among mountain trails, and of otters along wetland margins. We can even imagine the invisible migratory paths of birds in the air. Those ways we see and cannot are worn through generations so that others find the ways to wherever they need or want to go. By feel and faith, wild things find the way. With each new birth, hatching, coming and going, the azimuths are burned into instinct so that species become who and what they are, and within the crucible of adaptation that nature exerts, move through time. Who we are and what we are because we followed paths to this place. Those paths have been worn into stone and sand and silt and clay and loam and ice and snow. Those paths have trodden ground as free people and of those bound in chains. Our five-toed clumsy prints lie beside flat-footed five-clawed bears wandering along downstream and cloven-hooved deer arrowing single file to tender sweet patches. We make trails and speed on superhighways. Our ways have been made good and worn bad.
Yeah, thank you, Drew. By feel and faith. I'm Art Goodtimes, and I'm in the Nooch homeland on Wrights Mesa, on the cusp of the Colorado Plateau and the Southern Rockies. I'm a founding member of the Union of Mountain Poets and a mushroom thaumaturge. This is a selection from Canticle. Enough of kingdoms! Instead, let there be kingdoms. The fungal kingdom, the floral kingdom, the faunal kingdom, where we hum the body's every bone in honor of the making and the yet unmade. All of us kin, co-creators, in conversation, Macready says, with what shines, and with those divine goddess rhizomes rooted in the deeper dark, where life springs full blown from the spark of matter.
I love you, Art. You are the spark of matter. And that's why my daughters insisted that I close with you tonight. And everyone, thank you. I'm so grateful. And for the audience members, I know someone out there named Kate said, hey, let's make sure we honor earthly kin as well. And I tried to do that by setting us into the solstice and the time of year we're in, but I appreciate that, Kate. And so what I'll do here is take a moment, for everyone, just kind of have a moment of silence, let whatever this flow of readings, whichever aspect of it sunk in for you, kind of hold on to that, the feeling of it, and use it as a source of energy for gratitude to all the earthly kin that make everything possible. Let's just take a moment for that, and then I'll open up some conversation. What I'll do is I'll be studying the questions from the audience while I'm listening to the conversation that comes from a question I have. And that question has to do with, I was really moved, obviously, by all of these. One of the things, Robin, your analogy of a party really makes the planetary scale of ethics that I was expressing concern about accessible, right? And friendly and joyful and playful. And, Marcia bringing rocks to life. That to me is the ultimate test of any form of kinship. If one can feel kinship with rocks, then it's just that much easier, right? To feel that personhood from all beings. Kind of like Caradwin, who couldn't make it tonight. He sends his regrets, says about the moon. We can see the moon as kin. That's a radical act that makes it very difficult to objectify any inch of earth and not see every inch as kin. And so really all of you brought to life the planetary scale that makes ethical possibility accessible on that scale. But I'm curious if there are any thoughts about the kind of place-thing movement and how might we avoid a binary between the planetary scale and the sense of place, which is often an environmental justice movement. How do we merge the two? How do we have the power of place on a planetary scale? And I'll open with that and just open it up to anybody while I look at questions from the audience.
Well, I think places come in many sizes and shapes. So it's a fractal thing. We're embedded in so many different kinds of places. We share the atmosphere, absolutely, globally. That's our shared place. And I think that learning your own place, the names of birds and mushrooms and stones in your own backyard then opens up the rest of the world. So I don't think that there's a tension there. I think that they're complementary.
I think it took a long time to understand what planet meant growing up until I saw that NASA photo. And then I understood what this blue planet meant. And then Lovelock and Margolis's idea about Gaia, it suddenly became a real living entity.
I think to feel it as an entity, for me, entails letting this two-armed, two-legged form be my smaller body, and the earth as my larger flesh, as this vast spherical metabolism in which our individual bodies are embedded. If I feel the planet as flesh, as body, then each place is its own organ within that body. Each place, its own a kind of tissue or organ, and they're so different and so diverse. And wherever I am, I want to live appropriately to the ways of this organ.
One of the things, you know, when we think about place, I think at least from a conservation standpoint, and at least as much as we talk about wildness and the permutations of wildness, that unfortunately we've made place aspirational, right? It's someplace else that we have to be to feel in place. And so I think part of the kinship really is that concept, you know, as David said, a circulatory system. So we can think about watersheds, obviously, but every single person being upstream, but also downstream of the next. And so connecting the bad air that's melting Arctic ice to the bad air that brown and black and red children can't breathe in begins to shrink the world. And so I think as we shrink it, place becomes tangible to others, other places, not just aspirational, but connected in that way.
I was just thinking about, I work with a lot of young people, and the thing that I think that beginning with the smallest things, beginning with a connection to introducing people to that connection first, allows them to care, because I think that in some cases there's such a large disconnect that we need to just take these steps to get to know all of the creatures and all of the beings, the rocks, the fungi, and then the other human beings that are in a community. And until we're actually connected at this personal level, it's hard to really have real, to think of, you know, this sort of kinship with this larger sort of abstract space that can eventually, I think, move into the organ that David talks about. But I think it does begin with a very local and really intimate personal connection. And then it can build.
You know, a couple of questions are emerging from this, because you're talking about connection as the antidote to objectification of an entire planet, or even in Carradwin's article, he says the moon, he laments that the moon's being called an eighth continent from a resource extraction perspective. And without connection, you end up seeing just a stockroom of resources, right? And devoid of ethical responsibility. And Jessica here, and I'll follow that up with a similar question from Alexandria. And Alexandria's is more directed toward you, Robin. But Jessica asks, I'm curious to hear more about the relationship between the notion of a planetary scale and histories of colonialism. Right? That scale itself might be an outcome and tool of colonialism. So how can kinning on a planetary scale be a decolonial practice? And I think, Alexandria, your question complements that, directed more at Robin. I have a question for Robin. In your essay, you discuss humans coming to the reunion empty-handed when you write, but the illusion of empty-handedness is part of the colonial amnesia. I wonder if you could speak more to this colonial amnesia. And so I'm curious if we can talk a little bit about how might we find a planetary practice of kinship that takes on the colonial histories that led to a planetary scale, and that takes on or builds an alternative to colonial amnesia.
I love the directions that this is going, John. Thank you for bringing us that question. And the colonial amnesia that I'm referring to is this notion of human exceptionalism, right? You know, that we are somehow, you know, on top of this hierarchy of being as our own species, which we then perpetuate through colonialism, because that exceptionalism that creates this fictional hierarchy of thinking that the riches of the world belong more to some people than to others. It is the heart of othering, where othering is not celebrated as, oh my, I am glad you are different than me and I want to know you, but othering as inferior. And that, I think, is part of the underpinnings of the colonial enterprise. In particular, though, the questioner is asking about this notion of abundance. And it's related to human exceptionalism. You know, where does abundance come from? It's, you know, the wellspring is the land and beings and our relatives around us. And where does abundance come from? It comes when we share, when we're not stuck in hyper individualism of accumulation and so forth, of thinking about the land and other beings as property and commodity. That creates scarcity. I mean, capitalism and market economies demand scarcity, whereas abundance engenders sharing, and that's part of the amnesia of colonialism.
Would anybody like to build off of that, or shall I bring in another question? There's another question that's kind of related, I think, and that's more the building, Rob. And someone asked about the role of song in developing kinship with the planet. But did I just cut somebody off? I'm sorry.
Well, no, I just wanted to piggyback a bit. As a descendant of colonial ancestors, my teacher, Dolores LaChapelle, told us to find a sacred place and stay there. And I think Indigenous people understand this often, and they can trace their roots back generations. But so many of us, often rootless, not all, but so many of us rootless Euro-Americans who've settled here or been brought here and forced to work here, whatever our ancestry. For me, the only way to get to the planetary scale that NASA revealed in that photo, for me, was to focus on the local and to really get local, get really down, to understand every inch of the acre I've been caretaking for the last 40 years, to really know what it means to be kin with the place, the planet, my friends, the rocks, all of it. And so in some ways, I guess the whole idea of abundance comes from being in a place, seeing the gifts that are there, and learning that I can eat the things that are the asparagus that came with us as colonial invaders, that I can eat the natives. I can also share. I can share my body, share my vision. And like our county did, take real action, make a formal apology, government to government, from my county to our Ute neighbors. I mean, there are lots of local actions that I think have planetary kinship, kinning possibilities.
We have two questions that are related again. And David, I'm going to ask you to kind of perk up a bit here. Anybody can speak to this, but I think we'll start with David. Maury Bean, and by the way, speaking to abundance, Natasha earlier asked about the role of song, and we can get back to that. But Maury Bean asked, would anybody like to speak to ecotones as a metaphor for evolution? Maury Bean, I think this is brilliant, of our place in between. So an ecotone between planet and place, the place where biomes meet, places where our movement happens, the liminal places where change happens. And then Kate Judith says, mostly to David, responding to the rhythmic flow you described in your evocative sentences, could you speak about the communicative power of rhythm? So we're looking at, from Maury Bean, like ecotone, the edge between habitats, or between planet and place, between scales. And then could you speak about the communicative power of rhythm? How rhythm offers the possibility of responses to it. It is readable, so can become read in vastly diverse ways. The salmon rhythm, for example, becomes read into the stories of so many beings, including rock beings, Marcia, and changes them. Do you want to start us out, David?
Oh, sure. So yeah, I'm hearing song, I'm hearing tone, I'm hearing rhythm, tone and the ecotone. So maybe just simply to say, it seems to me utterly key in opening up my kinship and beginning to kin with all the beings around me in the place where I find myself, to just drop this goofy notion that there is some divide between things that are animate and some things that are inanimate, and just allow that it's all animate, that everything's alive. That opens the rich possibility of relationship everywhere, but not just that everything's alive or that everything has agency, including and especially the rocks and the winds and the rivers, but also that everything speaks, that everything is expressive, that each thing has its own eloquence. Bird's song, of course, cricket rhythms, yeah, but also the wind in the willows, the splashing speech of the waves on the pebbled beach, or the rain on the leaves. But even any sound can be a voice laden with meaning, and any movement can be felt and experienced as a gesture, as something communicating. So opening that possibility.
Any movement can be a gesture if everything's alive in a relationship. And Marcia, I wonder if that sparked some thinking for you, since David honored the way you think about rocks. And Kathy here says, can Marcia talk more about our ventures into space and our disregard for our planet? I'm curious if anything David said, sparked anything for you in terms of how you think about relationships on Earth and beyond.
Well, certainly rhythm, the metaphor of breathing, but I also think of dancing. The continents are dancing around the globe all the time. It's been a beautiful, complicated choreography, Tai Chi rather than something more energetic, I guess. So certainly there are these rhythms that are embedded at different timescales. Some of them are just things we can glimpse out of the corner of our eye, and others are things that we can partake in directly. And I was reminded of Heather's poem about the geese waiting for the ice that didn't come, and the rhythms being disrupted in strange ways where somehow the beat has been lost and nature's confused.
Yeah, just a couple more sentences to that last bit. Nature's confused.
Well, the phonologies that are unfolding in ways that are uncoordinated right now. It's like suddenly the conductor has lost the baton, and different members of the orchestra are playing in different tempi.
Species emergence is confused. The ecotones themselves are confused. Anybody want to pick up on that?
I just say one tiny thought to the sense of rocks rocking, dancing. It seems to me that our goofy notion that matter is inert or inanimate is tied to our sense that that being, or our forgetting that being is a verb, that simply to exist is a very active thing to be doing, to allow that being is animate itself, that being is a verb. To say that the mountain is there, the mountain breathes there, the river breathes here.
Drew, yours is really a call to action on almost a world historical moment scale. And Paul and Scott here are both asking about action. Scott's asking more about storytelling, which I think, Bron, Art, Heather, Robin, everybody can speak to, and what advice we all have for how to make a more compelling story for others to think about kinship in this way. And Paul here is asking, he says he's struggling with how to turn this love of kinship and the knowledge of kinship into activism that can manifest real change. I will plug we'll continue to have these book clubs. And I think the April one will cover practice, because Paul, I had exactly that question as an editor and wanted to make sure we ended with that. But I'm curious, you know, either action in terms of finding shared language and compelling storytelling that awakens this view of relationships and kinship and personhood, like Gavin said, all the way to like actual action and practice for turning this love of kinship and knowledge of kinship into activism that manifests real change. And Drew, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay. And others can jump in.
Thanks for the question. For me, I always talk about social movement beginning in the mirror, really, and it's an intention, right? With that image that you see, full front on, hopefully nothing to hide, but with that intention then to move outward from that. So I have my students, for example, at the beginning of the semester to write an intention for the class for their environmental ethics, so for their place. And then as we check that going through the semester, that intention, and it expands, right? Use whatever metaphor of sort of compounding that you will, but the pebble in the pond that ripples outward. Ultimately, it reaches some shore, someplace far away. And then when we can't see it, reverberates through soil and rock and root up to trees and back again. So that might begin with that individual looking in that pond, looking in that puddle and dropping that pebble. So that's action. And I think we discount that. I think it's easy, and there's a place for us to take to the streets and to be loud. But if we aren't truthful with self first, then we're working on this in this place really of hubris and just trying to make ourselves feel better for what it is that we're doing instead of working to make better outside of ourselves. So that action, I think, is important, and to have that every day, and then head laying on pillow at night to ask the question: Did I move it forward some little bit? So that's an experiment, and it's a daily experiment, and it's an action and protest. I call them micro protests. We can talk about microaggressions. We can talk about micro protests that build day by day by day, imperceptibly so to most from the outside. But I think ultimately that moves us someplace. And that incantation, those meditations that we have to do within, to do that hard work within, ultimately that comes out. So you drop the pebble within, it goes out.
Heather, you talk about etching a new map in your poem. Does that speak to you at all?
So the idea of etching a new map for me has so much to do with partly thinking about how devastated people are when they start to recognize all of the damage that we've done, and it's environmental damage, and it's, environmental justice is another piece of that. And I think that I think so often, just in terms of the students that I work with are coming into this world and they're feeling this sort of apocalyptic overwhelm, and one of the things that I feel is that offering them ways to enter into intimacy with the earth, and often that is providing them the language that they don't know. It's providing them these ideas that are striking and surprising to them. Robin has an essay that has this great thing where she says, first you pay attention, and then it becomes intention, and then it becomes action. And my students think about this, they think okay, well, how can we get, action to happen? And what they realize is that it starts with themselves. Like Drew says, looking in the mirror. How did they open up? And it started with wonder. It started with connecting on a really personal, deep level. And then I mean, the thing is that we have this blank space. We have so many spaces that are damaged that it's time for us to access our sense of attention and love and commitment, and then move forward with that. And for me, etching a new map, often comes out like poetry. And for me, a lot of my connection, I resonate a lot with what David has written about sort of arresting the humanness and allowing these other voices to come forth. And for me, that's the same place that poems come from. And so that's my odd answer.
I wonder, at the risk of over-directing here, I mean, that was so rich, Heather. I wonder if, Robin, you'd feel comfortable speaking to how she just honored you and what you say about attention. And then Bron, you talk about the dark green, you kind of coined that. I wonder if that's what we're getting at. And David, I would love it if you would comment on arresting humanness, your concept, and how we're dancing around that. But Robin, would you mind?
I'd love to, because as I was listening, this wonderful image came to mind, Heather, related to attention and as a pathway to love, and therefore to kinship. I was once teaching a writing workshop, and all of the folks in the room were writing very human stories. And what I wanted to do is to try to have them engage by listening to more than human stories and add more than human characters into their own stories to decenter themselves. So it will surprise no one, perhaps, that I brought little cups, little bowls of moss into the writing workshop. And it was a great equalizer. Nobody but me looks at mosses. So I said, here are these foreign beings. I want you to write them into your story. These little beings, which meant they had to pay deep attention. They had to write these detailed descriptions about these mosses, right? It was a fun exercise, but the reason I'm telling you this story is by the end of their paying attention to these mosses and listening to their stories and weaving those little mosses into the story that they'd already told and thought there was no room for more than human characters. At the end of that, I went to gather up the mosses and everyone said, don't take them. We love them. We love them. Could we go put them back in the woods? And they'd never cared about mosses, ever looked at mosses, but it was the pathway from attention to love. By weaving those mosses into their own stories, they came to love them and wanted to do right by them. They felt a sense of a need for justice for those mosses. And that's what I wanted to share as an amplification of what you just offered, Heather, of this pathway to love by attention, and to David's notion of the intense listening to these other voices who are around us and how it changes us and changes us at a local scale, which ripples to the planetary scale, as you've heard.
I'm glad you brought up David, because I was thinking, I think maybe under Robin's guidance, I could have attention and intention and gratitude with moss, but how I would extend it to the planet would be hard. And then I remembered David's essay. So it makes it easier. Someone else was speaking there. I apologize.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to add, you said that we should be tuning in on each other. So I just wanted to say, the other thing about this idea of attention and intention and action, which is such a beautiful idea, and it does work. Robin, thank you. It's also listening to the voices of others. And I think that one of the amazing things about Drew Lanham's essay about convergence, where there's an imagined conversation between Rachel Carson and Martin Luther King Jr., is that there's this idea that there are these two separate things going on, and that those need to merge. And that same kind of attention that leads to love can also happen by listening to the voices of other people, these stories, back to the storytelling. Thank you for that question. But that is, that's another way to make us move to that global scale, right? Is because when you start to care about one other voice, you listen, you hear it, just like you listen to the mosses, and then suddenly you're in this movement, and you didn't even mean it. It's because you love it. You're filled with love. Okay, I'll be quiet.
No, didn't even mean it. I like a lot. Bron, I'm curious if you're intersecting with your concept of the dark green, what that looks like.
Well, there's so many connections here. I hardly know where to wade in and agree with so much of what I've heard. Part of what I was thinking is that there's a real conundrum here that we haven't spoken about. And that is, I mean, on the one hand, everybody is sort of saying we need to profoundly attend to the liveliness of the world. And from that comes a felt kinship. And when you feel that you are related to someone or to something, with that comes quite logically a sense of moral responsibility to one's relations. The problem, of course, is that there are so many of us, and so many of us are urbanized, and so many of us are drenched in cultures that do not promote that kind of liveliness, that kind of attention to the liveliness of the world. And some of that's because people are increasingly urbanized and kind of locked up in cement jungles. And I think that's one reason that so many people are moved to storytelling, to using the arts, to try to evoke and awaken in people something that the assumption is, the kind of epistemological assumption here is that deep down inside of us, we all have that kind of biophilia just waiting to be awakened and touched. So, of course, there's many traditional stories that promote that. A good part of what I write about in the Dark Green Religion book is the remarkably diverse ways in which people are expressing and promoting these kinds of feelings through new forms of storytelling, from motion pictures to, rock music and punk music and so forth. And in museums and aquariums around the world, oftentimes drawing on the incontrovertible science that we all are quite literally biologically related. We share a common ancestor. We all emerge, as best we know right now, from the oceans. And so we are literally kin in that sense. So from there, and then from the science of ecology, we get this deep sense of profound interconnection. Now, this is an ancient sensibility that we might call organicism. Lovelock and Margulis has been mentioned here by Art, came up with a clever trope for this ancient perception of interconnection as Gaia theory and so forth. So we have this kind of animate and animist spirituality, and we have a holistic organicist spirituality. And there are traditional stories that get us there, and there are scientific stories that get us there. And so I see a tremendous convergence and a engagement between these deep and resonant ancient stories and traditional stories and the scientific stories. And this very idea that kinship is so sticky in our minds and is coming forth in this beautiful work that you are all involved in, I think is another example of this kind of, for lack of, just looking for some tropes that didn't have a lot of baggage, this kind of dark green spirituality that really is about the love of nature and the felt sense that it all matters, it all has intrinsic value. I think it gets at that, both at the local level, that intimate relationship with non-human organisms in the wider natural world and living systems themselves, and then the whole biosphere and indeed the entire universe, that we're all a part of it. So anyway, I think that even in the midst of this cataclysm that's unfolding, where it's difficult to be optimistic, there are tremendous global trends that are emerging where people are coming together in these global intellectual and social movements that are salutary and provide some significant hope. And that's what I try to pay attention to and write about and encourage along the way.
You know, one thing, I don't know, am I muted? No. I dig very much what you're saying, Bron. The hope, there's a hope that sparks in me a lot, just in what I'm hearing from each of you, also, not just in what we're speaking about, but in the ways of our speaking. That is, in the way of our giving voice, each in our own way, to what we love. I feel like a big hidden motor behind the ecological crisis is we two-leggeds are also so darned abstract and disembodied in our feeling that we're not noticing and picking up on what the land around us is feeling. It seems to me a simple practice that I like to infect, and that I feel like each of you is spreading each in your own way, a practice of speaking, since we're speaking creatures, taking care with our speaking to not be talking as disembodied minds to other disembodied minds, using these incredibly abstract terms one hears in the academy, like, you know, intersectionality and overdetermination, or deconstructive hermeneutics, or indexical, or normativity, or these are all words that only humans can possibly understand. And of course, then just a very narrow range of humans. Yeah. But can we begin to speak not as disembodied minds, but as full-bodied creatures, finding phrases and words like each of y'all are doing that actually tickle your toes, or, you know, or itch your nostrils and make you sneeze. That is speaking as a body, a full-bodied creature. Yes, with a head too, but the head is part of the body. I feel like that draws our listeners into their bodies, and they start feeling the world around them much more, because we're speaking in ways that other creatures can also pick up on and understand.
Wow, that's incredible. And I'm just going to pause for 1 second and ask Stephen, because I think some folks are going to want to riff off of what Dave just said. And then I'm sorry, I can't get to every audience question, but there are two toward the end that I think are relevant. Stephen, how much time, how are we doing? Speakers, how are you doing? I was going to ask for folks to follow up on what Dave said, and then read at once 2 audience questions as a kind of see who wants to offer closing thoughts. Does that work for everybody? So Art and Robin and anyone else who was about to jump in when I talked, please jump in. Go ahead. Art and Robin, you both talk about key and the first 2 letters in kin, right? I know they're not completely connected, but I know, Art, you were inspired by Robin, but you're doing a collection of poems on key right now. And maybe in sort of in honoring what Dave was saying about the human gift becoming a human responsibility to speak in a way that awakens those interconnections Drew was talking about that start within. Robin, can you speak a bit about key? I think Gavin referred to it earlier about being careful with our pronouns. I know you speak about that with reference to not calling the moon it. And then Art, I don't know what you want to do. If you have a draft, you want to share a little snippet or just talk about the project, and then folks can riff off of that. And if not, I can share these last 2 audience questions. Robin?
Yeah, just real quickly, because I want to hear from Art about the way that you are weaving this in. You know, the notion for me, as you've mentioned, John, is that when we have this sense of kinship and the personhood and the liveliness of the world, to speak of our relatives as it feels deeply painful. We rob them of their personhood when we do that. And so I had been doing this experiment, as many of you know, in how might we infuse English with the kind of grammar of animacy which is present in many indigenous languages. In my Potawatomi language, it's impossible to say it about a blue jay. You just can't. You have to talk about a blue jay with the same grammar that you would for your family member. And so in searching for a way to do that, in my language teachers, I asked him, is there a word for just a being, just a being, and that, unites all of us? And he said, of course, it's B'madisi Aki. It's a being of the earth. But we're not going to make that work in English. But B'madisi Aki, the etymology there, Aki actually means the earth. And so it was that little sound at the end of Aki, like the little breath at the end of saying Aki, that I thought, oh, that breathing being, could we use Ki to mean you? To mean that one who is alive, that person who is sharing breath with us, is Ki. And so that we could say he and she when we need to, when it's right and appropriate. And we can say it when we have to talk about paper clips and bulldozers, but each other, our kinfolk, could we say Ki about those maple tree, about those geese looking for ice, about those rocks who are deeply alive? And art, I understand, has been, in your own wonderful way, breathing into Ki and breathing it out again to listeners.
Exactly. And Robin, it was so wonderful when you came to Telluride and to do a workshop and to start to understand how our very language objectifies the world. And is there a way to change that? And I'm a poet. I'm a person who takes language seriously. I've studied linguistics and Latin and Greek, and I love the idea of using a Potawatomi word. And then, of course, you pick Ki, which is such a wonderful word in English. Ki just tells us so much about a lot of things. It's what unlocks the whole animate world for us. And then to use that, the discipline of using that in language is very hard. I have a grammatical mind that I can't break. And so for me, because I write poetry, I take time with every word, I'm able to start to incorporate the idea of Ki. And every time I think of it, I start thinking of Ki. I start thinking of the animacy, not just of rocks and trees and everything else, but of power lines, of houses, of the paper that I just wrote. Everything around me is organic chemistry. Everything around me is Ki. And so the practice as a poet, I write. And so the practice of writing Ki into my poetry has been just a wonderful way to activate that concept in my own mind.
Let the silence hang to see if any of our authors just have something at the tip of their tongue from what Robin and Art just said, inspired by David.
I remember when I sent my manuscript to my editor, which is my nonfiction book, which was about insects. I referred to all the insects in the book, which were primarily bees, as she, and that was like, there was some riffles there. And I had to convince them that it was okay, that we could call them she and not it. I couldn't do it either, Robin. It's just, my relationship was too deep with them. I felt that it was offensive.
Bravo.
Well, I just want to honor some of the questions we will not have time to get to tonight, and end with one. The Weavers Project says they're curious about how the authors are thinking about the urban environment in relationship to kinship networks and this deep knowing of a living and breathing planet. I think that's going to become an incredibly important question when place is covered. And any author can type an answer into the Q&A for the Weavers Project there. Thank you for that question. There's another question here that's been dancing around my mind. I don't like forcing things in, so I couldn't find a space, but someone asked, an anonymous attendee asked, how do we reconcile the ways in which internet technology can allow us to connect as humans across space so seamlessly like tonight, but the ways in which it also feels so disconnected from our living world. How can we best translate digital kinning to our embodied lives? What a wonderful question. This Zoom user here, I just think was inspired to express themselves in new language. As an old ecologist, I love when years of pondering an ecological puzzle suddenly resolves into clearer understanding. In this same vein, innumerable observing while riding as an infant on mama's shoulders eventually resolved into recognition that prominent mountains, large fir trees, stars, moon bobbing up and down with mama's steps while smaller near trees rush on by us.
Yes.
Stars sparkle and follow like mama's eyes, and constellations and eyes of family follow too as kin. So that merging of a life in ecology with maybe an earliest memory of kinship, mother and everything. A great question here that I hope comes up again in the Partners or Practice volume book clubs, related to Christopher's question and Marcia's response in the Rights of Nature movement. Non-human persons are given legal protections. Those legal protections being the same protections that a human has. How can we ensure those protections are carried out when the legal rights that humans supposedly have are often violated? An anonymous attendee asked, what is the sound that is not human language that you would make to dance with continents, rocks, rivers, and snails? I would love to hear, this is John, I'd love to hear that sound. So I'll just end with this. Courtney here asks, does anyone care to share their preferred somatic practice to connect with the earth? And I wonder, Gavin, if you're comfortable, we don't have to have everyone share, but we could get a sampling of people who have a clear practice for connecting with the earth. We talked a lot about the power of language, the inner work Drew was talking about that can move without. But I know, Gavin, you have one that's inspired me. Do you want to share that?
Well, I think I know what you're talking about, John, but I'm gonna share something. Maybe this is it. Maybe it's not.
Yeah.
But it relates in the very same way, because they're both built on listening. We've heard it's kind of come up again and again in our conversation tonight. You know, the importance of listening, the importance of music, of rhythm, of tuning in to those larger metabolisms of place and earth. And we can't do that if we're always talking, if we're always shouting. We have to settle in. This kind of gets back to a little bit of something what Drew was talking about, with intention and with every moment is not a moment for protest. There are moments they're a necessary self-work, contemplative work that if this diverse being that is us, you know, is not exchanging and is only speaking out, then we're not being nurtured or fed. So in line with that, it really came up for me when David was talking about, you know, the body, speaking from the body, tingling, you know, language that tingles your nose, that touches you, that moves you somatically. Reminded me of one of our authors, Tim Ingold, who's an anthropologist, and I believe he's in volume 4. He talks about how a lot of Western culture is head over heels. They've gotten the head on top of the body has become dominant, and it's supplanted the importance of the heels, the feet. And I think that you'll probably know where I'm going with this. So my somatic practice is a foot-based practice. A lot of times I walk a lot. I feel the terrain, I feel the earth with my feet. And skin to skin if I can, you know, like, so that means being the weirdo who has their shoes off, you know, in a non-beach setting sometimes, even when it's cold, you know, or even when it's wet, because there's something that is not just grounding literally about that, but then my body becomes a medium, a conversation partner, a part of the ability through which I hear what's happening in the terrain. So feeling the world with our bodies. And so I would just say, instead of head over heels, maybe go heels over head.
I love that. Well, Suzanne and I are hiking with you on Saturday, so on International Mountain Day. So I'm going to hold you to this skin to skin practice,
All right.
Gavin.
Yeah, I
Would
have
anybody else have something like
I was going to
that,
piggyback on that
visceral?
in part because, Gavin, you maybe wonder whether you remember the exercise we started off with, the radical environmentalism class, experimenting with the epistemologies of the animistically inclined radical environmentalists who we were engaging that semester. And one of the exercises was, in fact, to get out and walk barefoot.
That's why your
experiment
classes
with
were
the kinds of
fun.
energies that they suggest is a way to kinship, really. Yeah. And I was also thinking about the language thing because inspired by some of you, and for over a long time, David, we met in, I think, 93, a long time ago. And I've been thinking about our conversations ever since. Mm-hmm. And so I am always quite verbal, usually when I'm alone and wouldn't be embarrassed by other humans thinking I'm crazy or something, but I'm really very verbal out in the world. And of course, I don't often know what the gender is of the various organisms that I'm engaging if I'm going to do that verbally. So I just am kind of in the habit of saying, using adjectives like, well, good morning, beauty, or maybe their species name as we know it, and then just kind of look for the reaction. And I've learned over the years that the more I do that, especially with organisms that I'm going to see more than once, the more we're engaged. And I think it's possible also to this is a little woo-woo of me, I guess, but it's possible, I think, to kind of project an energy out into the world that is welcoming. And we do that with humans, right? With the facial expressions, a smile, whether we're open or closed to another human, that's quite ordinary. But we can do that with all kinds of life forms, and we can cultivate that and experiment with that. And it leads to some, it leads to a lot of interesting reflections on our connections with non-human organisms. And, so for just one example, I think I'm in relationship with some osprey up by the ocean. And I surmise that they're proud of their fishing abilities and that they don't just take their fish and run off to their nest, but they want to, like a cat that brings in the mouse, they want to show it off perhaps because I cheer them on in their fishing exploits. Now, that's just a creative imagination on my part, but we know enough about our evolutionary continuity with other organisms to know that that's not a crazy thing to wonder about and to cultivate and nurture and see what comes of it.
It's a beautiful practice. And I think, Robin, since you're one of our co-editors, and since you have inspired so much of us around attention to intention to action, might you end the night with your somatic practice? If you have something you do that the listeners can consider as beyond ideas from a collection of books, but a thing they can try on for size within 24 hours.
One of the things that really helps me feel both in place and on the planet and transcend those levels is deep attention to breath and following the molecules. Following the molecules and knowing that as I am breathing in the gift of the exhalations of my plant relatives, that gives me an amazing feeling of groundedness and belonging and gratitude. I breathe because you breathe. And then in reciprocity, I breathe out what they need. And I just take the time to imagine those molecules moving through the air between us, and it reinforces for me always the sense of kinship and always the sense of being at home.
So
I'm going to let the word home be the last word of the night. Thank you, everybody. Let's all thank our authors and all of you for your engagement with the collection, Point Reyes Books, and Stephen and the whole crew there, and being a next level community convening, conversation curating presence in the literary world, and to the Center for Humans and Nature, humansandnature.org. It is an endless archive of heartfelt home building brilliance. Thank you, everybody. I'm so grateful. Enjoy the collection. And Stephen, do you want to say anything about the other book clubs coming up?
I don't want to talk too much to take anything away from what's transpired here over the last hour and a half. Beautiful conversation. I put a link in. We'll share it as well on our website, ptraysbooks.com, for the upcoming meetings. And again, the recording will be available on YouTube in the next couple of days. Thank you all so much. I'm riveted. I'm so many notes and so many things to mull over. And as I often say at the end of these, my only regret is that we're not all in a room together here in Point Reyes. But we'll make that happen in one way or another at some point in the future.
You promise?
I promise, yeah. John, thank you so much. And Gavin, yeah.
Thank you so much, you all. So beautiful to see old friends and meet new ones who I've been reading, all of you.
Looking forward to some more path crossings with all of you.
Absolutely. Thank you. This is really special.
Thank you all. I'm so honored to have been here with all of you. And all of you that I can't see too.
Much love, y'all.
Thanks, everyone.
Happy upcoming solstice.
Love to all.
We'll see you again in January.